Somebody just mentioned my prose autobiography book, Jersey Breaks, where I tell that story about Bob. A poem I quote by William Carlos Williams that's quite important to me. Uh, I'll read. Williams had a grandmother who was quite important to him, whose name was Emily Dickinson Welcome. And this is his poem about her. And as I hope I say in the prose, uh, the poem embodies important things about the United States and immigration, and also about poetry. The poem tells a story that is partly, quite deliberately, impossible to follow. And it reminds me of listening to my great aunts and great uncles at family gatherings, giving the family history. And there were so many second marriages and arguments and people with the same name. It was impossible for a child to follow. And for me, something important about culture, high, low, and middle, is caught by this poem by Williams. Dedication for a plot of ground. This plot of ground facing the waters of this inlet is dedicated to the living presence of Emily Dickinson Welcome, who was born in England, married, lost her husband, and with her 5-year-old son sailed for New York in a two-master, was driven to the Azores, ran adrift on Fire Island Shoal, met her second husband in a Brooklyn boarding house, went with him to Puerto Rico, bore 3 more children, lost her second husband, lived hard for 8 years in St. Thomas, Puerto Rico, San Domingo, followed the eldest son to New York, lost her daughter, lost her baby, seizing the 2 boys of the oldest son by the second marriage, mothered them, they being motherless, fought for them against the other grandmother and the aunts, brought them here summer after summer, defended herself here against thieves, storms, sun, fire, against flies, against girls that came smelling about, against drought, against weeds, storm tides, neighbors, weasels that stole her chickens, against the weakness of her own hands, against the growing strength of the boys, against wind, against the stones, against trespassers, against rents, against her own mind. She grubbed this earth with her own hands, domineered over this grass plot, blackguarded her eldest son into buying it, lived here 15 years, attained a final loneliness, and if you can bring nothing to this place but your carcass, keep out. And that lines like the second son, oldest son by the second marriage, huh? It is exactly like listening to my relatives say, well, then he married the other Margulis, but when they didn't get along, he went to Cincinnati, and the other son came. What? Slow down, folks. And he chose the name William Carlos Williams. I think he published some early work as. Am I hard to hear? Someone just say something like that?
You're fine.
He went from he tried being William Williams, W.C. Williams, and he has said that English was not the main language spoken in his house when he was growing up. It was French. His father was a Brit. And William Carlos Williams, I think he chose a good American name with the almost too ordinary, almost joke of a first name and last name. escorting left and right the Spanish name, also quite an ordinary name, William Carlos Williams. And I get a patriotic feeling from his settling on that name, on his telling what for me is a very characteristic American immigrant story, that it's messy, it involves perseverance and risk and confusion, and he makes a convincing hero out of Emily Dickinson Welcome, which she has written about otherwise. And if you're wondering whether part of my impulse is topical, that politically at this moment in American history, we're aware of nativism, I'm asking myself the same question. I wonder how much. I'm not sure, but I'm sure that I know that that has been part of my attraction to that poem and to Williams since I first read him. As I say, I welcome questions. I have a yes.
Oh, I do suddenly have a
Okay,
question.
Suzanne Lummis. Good.
Thank you for calling on me. I I see that poem, and I just put a note in the chat that that has always been my favorite of his poems. But I've also had trouble finding another poem of his that has quite that. To me, it has a contained rage. I don't know if other people read it the same way, a kind of fury and a kind of pacing. I don't see in his other poems, and I wonder if you know of any others of his that
I'll
have
be
that velocity.
I'll be glad to read a couple of my other favorite poems by Williams. Um, there's one about that same woman, Last Words of My English Grandmother. Um, there are so many. Um, this is perhaps my favorite Williams poem. Fine work with pitch and copper. You may have read that he is said to have had a typewriter in his examining room, and he sometimes whipped off a poem quickly between patients. Um, I picture him looking out the window and seeing roofers working across the street or visibly away. Anyway, fine work with pitch and copper. Now they're resting in the fleckless light separately and in unison, like the sacks of sifted stone stacked regularly by twos about the flat roof, ready after lunch to be opened and strewn. The copper in 8-foot strips has been beaten lengthwise down the center at right angles and lies ready to edge the coping. One still chewing picks up a copper strip and runs his eye along it. I just think the Suzanne's question is about pace. It's 3 questions. It incorporates that middle sentence of the 3, which could be in a handbook about roofing. The copper in 8-foot strips has been latent. The copper in 8-foot strips has been beaten lengthwise down the center at right angles and lies ready to wedge the coping. And pace is largely related to the vowels and consonants. It's a musical pace that we have in poetry. And he begins in the key of eh. Now they're resting in the fleckless light separately. Each of the first 3 lines has an eh. Now they're resting in the fleckless light separately in unison, like the sacks of sifted stones stacked regularly about the flat roof, ready after lunch to be opened and strewn. On the way, regularly by twos about the flat roof, ready after lunch to be opened and strewn. So, Suzanne, I don't know if that has the quality you mean by pace.
It's a
Um,
wonderful poem, and I didn't know it until now. So thank you for, well, I guess that's a gift, a
yeah,
new poem I didn't know.
I guess the pace in dedication for a plot of ground is partly a product of what I've called the confusion,
Mhm.
that the family story, characteristically of family stories, especially ones involving immigration, it leaps about from place to place. There's no orderly way to tell it. And when he gets to the things that she's fighting against, animals that'll kill her chickens, flies, girls that came smelling about, her own mind, whether it's a little bit more rational in a way, because it's a list, it's a more straight ahead catalog, not as much of a story. Um,
It sort of tumbles down the page too, doesn't it? It's kind of in free fall in a way. Um, it's like
freedom,
free
freedom and
fall,
regularity.
free
He loved
fall.
those, yeah, he liked
Yeah.
those line stanzas, and
Yeah.
he was a very musical writer. He says somewhere that when he was starting out, when he was young, he got Palgray's Treasury by heart. And Palgray's Treasury was once the by far most popular poetry anthology in American houses, and it was mostly 19th century poems in rhyme, some Shakespeare's contemporaries too, some we don't read anymore. And he clearly had memorized a lot of poems in rhyme. So when he says, now they're resting in the fleckless lights separately and in unison, like the sacks of
Mhm.
sifted stones stacked,
Mhm.
it's tumbling, but it's tumbling the way Mozart tumbles.
Yeah.
If you want a different idiom, the way
Mhm.
Duke Ellington tumbles. It's
Mhm.
tumbling in ways you can't quite predict, but that
Mhm.
make a certain
Mhm. Mhm.
elegant shape.
Mhm. Mhm.
Anybody else?
That was gorgeous. I wonder if I could move just briefly from pace to place with respect to William Carlos Williams and you and New Jersey. I've been rereading this book about a place called
Yes,
Hell, and
yes.
I actually studied with you in 1997. Don't expect you to remember because it was a little place called Provincetown at the Fine Arts Works Center where I write a lot about poems about that place. But you'd
True,
mentioned,
actually. Speaking of places, Provincetown,
yeah,
very
speaking of
important, very
places, okay,
particular American place. Yeah.
very, yeah. I mean, but to bring it back to you and to William Carlos Williams in New Jersey, and maybe a Mary Baraka, who you write about in your introduction, plays off this book in respect to the Newark city of man, I guess, in the Augustinian
Yes.
sense. He writes about the system of Dante's hell. You said something about nativism earlier, and I'm wondering if you could just comment on the importance of writing about one's place as a poet in America today, and especially you as a New Jersey poet, because it seems like there are a lot of New Jersey poets who focus in on a place that otherwise gets kind of shunted out of the collective memory, unless you have a Bruce Springsteen or Robert Pinsky or a William Carlos Williams, and we do. But I'm wondering if you could just talk about your relationship, either to writing about the place of New Jersey or writing in,
The culture I grew up in,
yeah.
characteristic of that state, was multi-ethnic, syncretic, full of all kinds of harmonies and contrasts. And it's still, when I was a kid, it might have been the early days of what used to be called tomato pie pizza. Today, very good Syrian food is to be had in North Jersey. Although the Syrian neighborhoods in places like East New York, Hoboken, Syrian neighborhoods now have sometimes turned into Dominican neighborhoods. And New Jersey is far from unique in having lots of ethnic groups. Willa Cather has written great books about the different kinds of Northern European and Eastern European immigrants, and some Western European, like her main characters, in the Great Plains. Our friend Garrick, who's hiding here, is from Hawaii, a state where there's definitely a different mix from the New Jersey one, but also a mix of cultures. And I have a wonderful colleague. He's the director of Black Studies in the BU English department, Louis Shude Soke. And Lewis's autobiography, which he titles Floating in a Most Peculiar Way, which immediately breaks the stereotype for a Black man writing an autobiography. Lewis writes wonderfully about the ways in which he is. Well, his father was an Igbo. When his father went to Sandhurst, his father was one of the founders of the short-lived country Biafra, and his mother was Jamaican. His early childhood was in a kind of semi-orphanage in Jamaica. Then he went to DC. Then he went to South LA. And a quotation that made me realize Lewis was going to be someone I liked talking to. I realized that when I read his writing, it's a wonderful book, beautifully written. Somebody had used the phrase cultural appropriation. And Lewis said, yes, yes, cultural appropriation. It used to be called culture. And I felt a New Jersey response to that in food and in music and in many things, culture, it's like the ears of musicians. You hear some other kind of music that's not the kind you know. The good musician immediately thinks about how to adapt it, steal from it, incorporate it, and so forth. And for me, you mentioned Springsteen, Williams. We could add Whitman, although in a way from New York State. Also, we have a what do they call them? The fuel and grocery rest stations on the New Jersey Turnpike. There's one named for Whitman, and I'm told. I mean, he would be very glad if what I was told was that the men's room there was often an important gathering place for gay men.
Perfect.
The spirit of all of the above is one of the things I sense in Williams. And I guess I've revealed my predisposition and my way of thinking about New Jersey. And it's true of Inferno too. Dante he had a syncretic imagination. And to his honor, his book, which became the Commedia, immediately attracted a lot of readers, very popular. It was for a very long time forbidden by the Catholic Church. which doesn't, that kind of censorship doesn't guarantee that a thing is good, but it suggests that it may well be.
Every time you just teach so much. I'm so grateful that you're here. I did want to say, if you remember, please say hi to Louis Chudasoke. He used to teach here with us at UC Santa Cruz, where I teach, and we were sad to lose him. One of my favorite
yeah.
classes with him was on Caribbean literature, and
You
talk
know
about
what
a
I'm
musical
talking about.
mind. Oh my God,
Yeah.
Louis. Thank you.
He's written very well about sound. The sounds surrounding all different kinds of music and recording, and he has a good imagination, that man. Oh, it's nice that I mentioned somebody that you you know. I will read a bit from. I have a book coming out in June, a book of poems called Proverbs of Limbo, and I'll read a couple of poems from it and invite questions. I'll read the first poem in Proverbs of Limbo. It's called Poem of Names, and it's longish. It goes to 2.5 type pages, just so you have an idea of what to expect. Poem of Names. The bad rain fell on Osamu Shimomura. On the walk home, it turned his white shirt black. Quote, my grandmother got me quickly into a bath. It likely saved me from death by radiation. End quote. Tuvalu's Ernst Berinsky would not discuss his family, killed by Nazis. Quote, an area I have liquidated for my mental health. End quote. His grave at Tuvalu, a kind of shrine. Salma begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed. Underground river of passion and retrenchment. Thank you, Elliot and Simon and Hazel, for wanting to talk with me about my dying someday. Bucky had been so cold when you touched his body. A compliment from me, that conversation. It almost doesn't matter what we said. I thought of Milford, your great-grandpa. That time I asked him, did he believe in life after death? I guess that you are my life after death, he said. A boy named Christian at a Q&A in Texas asked me, the visiting poet, what motivates you? What gets you out of bed each day? Good question. The pride of Ernst Berinsky of Mississippi. The shame of Nathan Forrest of Pillow Hill. Willie Lee Rose, historian of Reconstruction. Congressman Peter Pellegrino, called Pete. It's the dead people that motivate me, Christian. Dorothy Pinsky Wright. William Butler Yeats. As to your name, I remember Don Polk saying, quote, a lot of Jewish people think they're white, but no, they're not, end quote. In some ways, Yeats was a jerk. Arphaxad begat Salah. Salah begat Eber. Oh yeah, said Ruby to Don. Well, most Black people don't know their goyim, end quote. Somebody said about Rodino and Sarika, the night school guys are saving the country. Berinsky needed Joan Baez at the forums, Rodino in the House impeaching Nixon. Pellegrino means pilgrim. Shimamura discovered cells that made jellyfish glow. He garnered 1 million samples in Puget Sound. A protein in Aquaria Victoria, embedded to glimmer in other life, transformed all study of living things. Years later, the Exxon Valdez oil spill left nearly all those Aquaria dead. A poisoning that Shimomura indicted, he whose grandma had washed away the ashes. I hadn't known, I hadn't known that I was going to quote 2 poems with grandmas in them. And in fact, I mentioned to my grandkids my father, and when I read that poem, Williams's poem about his grandmother, Emily Dickinson Wellcome, I hadn't consciously been thinking of Osamu Shimomura, truly a great Nobel Prize winning scientist. And there we are.
Mm.
And I guess I read that poem to you partly in the spirit of trying to make sure you don't think I'm idealizing American culture, the culture I grew up in, or New Jersey, or are we free of all kinds of racism and anti-Semitism and conflict? Far from it.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, yes, please do.
So you started with Carlos Williams' poem, and it, as you said, it's there's so many people and so many relations that it's almost like the connections are not as important as the sound. And I find, I mean, I'm sure you thought about your own poem now when you read Carlos Williams, because the sounds of the names become music on its own. And I know that you are very interested and involved with music. And even when you read the Pitch and Copper poem, what came through is the music, even beyond the meaning of the words. So I guess what I'm wrestling with is this idea that sometimes the meaning might have a secondary importance to the actual sounds. So I was wondering if you have something to say about that.
Your name is Riva?
Ravit.
Revi. Revi, you touch on one of the most important questions about art and the art of poetry. When I quote these lines from the great 16th century translation of the Hebrew Bible, as we call it. It's partly Hebrew, partly in Aramaic, I think partly in some other language that I forget as well, aside from the people who read it in Greek. Salma begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed. And depending on what period of time you're in and what your scholarship is, Salma and Boaz and Obed, as I remember, and don't trust my scholarship, that's the line of Jesse that became the line of David which some Christian writers say then became the line of Jesus Christ, that either has quite a lot of meaning in ways that I just tried to very inexpertly gesture towards, or almost no meaning. Salma begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed. In my poem, it's almost as though I'm saying, Elvo begat Dada, and Dada begat Rembe. It's just a series of sounds. And my private thought I often have when people say, how come nobody ever reads poetry? Or do people read poetry anymore? I want to say, have you ever heard of the Holy Quran? Have you ever heard of the Bible? The reason people memorize the Quran relatively easily is that it's metrical. It has rhymes. It's like sounds. And as many kinds of music, Western classical music, all American hip hop, rock and roll, and jazz, coming as it does from gospel and blues, various kinds of sacred music. It's hard to say at any one point how much meaning is primary and how much the sound is primary. It's different for each person at different points in their life and at different points in time. But if it doesn't have some music, the meaning tends to go cold. And if it doesn't have any meaning, the music tends to lose passion. And if I had a good formula for how to deal with those ingredients in art, I'd patent it or something. I can't pretend to, but I know that's what we're looking for and what we're looking at. So, Rivet, the question is profound and unanswerable and well worth thinking about.
Hey, Robert, I've been holding you off asking a question. I was wondering, with your fondness for your predecessor from Long Branch, M.H. Abrams, if you've ever read his essay, The Fourth Dimension of a Poem.
I did the title. Who is speaking?
I'm sorry, it's Garrett.
Okay, Garrett, hiya. I don't remember that title. I don't remember the essay, The Fourth Dimension. Give me a hint. Tell me a little about it.
It's about sound. It's about sound in poetry. He calls sound the fourth dimension.
I do. I heard him. Mike, as my dad would call him, Mike wrote that essay late in his life, and I ascribed to everything in it. I'll confess that when he gave it, when he talked to me about it, I had to wonder, did he know that I had said all of that? I wanted to say, Mike, I say all of that about sound. Yeah, he was Mike Abrams in my family. Ruth Abrams was in my father's high school class in Long Branch, New Jersey. And I think my father must have been a little sweet on her. He always felt that she married an older man. I think Mike Abrams is about 3 or 4 years older than them. But my dad's regular poker game had Abrams' brother in it. So I heard of a great literary scholar and the great academic book, The Mirror and the Lamp. I was probably in the 4th grade. I already knew that that book was supposed to be a very good book. 20 years later, I read it, and it turned out it was very good. But yes, that essay, I can recommend it. And I do have that sneaking feeling that in this context, I'm confessing to, or I want to say, yeah, that's what I always say.
Well, thanks, Robert. I've always wondered about that. Because it does sound like you.
Yes, it does very much. And frankly, I think it was influenced by me, and I wish he had said so.
Well, usually he's so assiduous by attributing derivations. It's
Yeah.
shocking he did not.
Yeah. Though from New Jersey, and in fact, both from the New Jersey shore, neither Abrams nor I are perfect. I'll risk reading the title poem of Proverbs of Limbo. Rivet Connie mentioned music. I did recently record an album with some wonderful musicians, including the great hand drummer Mino Sinello, who's also appeared on albums by Miles Davis, but also Lawrence Hobgood, Stan Strickland. The album, too, is called Proverbs of Limbo, and I'm happy to say it's available on Spotify and Apple Music and so forth. We just finished it recently. This is a somewhat shorter poem. It fits on one page. Proverbs of Limbo. The Buddha is a liquor store on a busy corner. The proverbs of limbo flutter between the flames of righteousness and the pits of euphemism. Gibberish and heredity, runes of light, gnomons of shadow, bromides of. The Committee on Narrative has condemned it, but nevertheless, it may be a lie. Listen, begins a joke in the form of an aphorism. Cancer schmancer, so long as you've got your health. Listen, the author most quoted in the Houses of Parliament is William Blake. Conviction resounds in the byways of bloviation. Amid the lustful fires he walks, his feet become like brass. The annals of begats and the orders of names both balance on the triple pillars of identity and mystery and law, all bound and refuted by the cardboard belt God wears to amuse the angels. I make a joke there that I just made in talking to you. I say the Committee on Narrative has condemned it, but nevertheless it may be a lie. That's basically the same turn of mind that was talking about the Catholic Church paying Dante the compliment of indexing the Commedia and forbidding the reading of it. And William Blake sets a great model for poets. He set out to revivify Christianity by turning it inside out and upside down. And he wrote the Proverbs of Hell. And I have the nerve to call my book in this poem, The Proverbs of Limbo. And I begin with the Buddha is a liquor store on a busy corner, which I hope is a way of saying the Buddha is terrifically attractive and important. And to do it in a spirit that is not pious. I'm told there's a Zen saying that the Buddha is a very good stick for moving shit out of your way when you're walking. So I guess I had that in mind as well. I added a line to this poem And I'm reading from an older manuscript. And I think that what I want to do now is maybe read the poem to you again. I'll find it in my computer, or I'll find it somewhere, and read it to you without telling you what line I added. I guess because it amuses me, but also it seems a good idea. I'll find it. Proverbs of Limbo. The Buddha is a liquor store on a busy corner. The proverbs of Limbo flutter between the flames of righteousness and the pits of euphemism. Gibberish and heredity, runes of light, gnomons of shadow, bromides of oath. The Committee on Narrative has condemned it, but nevertheless, it may be a lie. Listen, begins a joke in the form of an aphorism. Cancer, schmancer, so long as you have your health. Listen, the author most quoted in the Houses of Parliament is William Blake. Conviction resounds in the byways of bloviation. Amid the lustful fires he walks, his feet become like brass. Clashes of theocracies, the annals of begats, and the orders of names both balance on the triple pillars of identity, of mystery, of law, all bound and refuted by the cardboard belt God wears to amuse the angels. I could have read it from here, but I want you to be quite sure I was putting it in the right place. I don't want to give you an exam. Did anybody notice that where I added the line? I'll confess.
Was it about the flame line and euphemism, or was it amidst the fire he walks? I didn't recognize either one of those.
It's that crazy thing that Blake says. I really don't understand what Blake is saying about his feet becoming like brass. It's right after, it's at that point that I decided, I tested it, I lived with it for a while. I asked some of my trusted advisors, and I did put in the line, clashes of theocracies. And it's a rare moment for me of, I'm telling you, your group, a lot of things I don't often say. It was my response to this period in history that makes me want to put my head under the covers. The Iranian theocracy, the theocracy that makes the Netanyahu government possible, the American theocracy that says it's really founded as a Christian nation. Anybody not of that religion is a temporary guest. And I realized that if my book was about all the distortions and exhaustions of my own moment in time in 2024, Always good to add a year. The spectacle of clashing theocracies and the evils they perpetrate seem to belong in the poem. So I put in a 3-word line: clashes of theocracies. And in keeping with the general aesthetic and method of the book, I don't try to say something insightful or polemically effective. I try to just put it there as part of the landscape. In that sense, I'm a landscape poet.
Is there a moment for a question?
Yes, Suzanne.
You've a couple of times mentioned the era we're living in and the political danger that we're in right now.
Yes.
Political
Yes.
and social danger. And it's something I've been trying to fight losing. No, I'm not effective, obviously, because it's all the terrible things are still going on. So nothing I've done has
And
helped.
I often think to
But-
myself, why hasn't Susan made some of this better? Suzanne,
I know, I blame
Suzanne
myself.
Lummis hasn't
It's
done
mostly-
anything to make this better.
If only I had just been more effective in my battles, my struggles against it. But
Yeah.
I would love to hear.
Shut up your game a little bit, Suzanne.
I know, I gotta get out there more. And and Robert, I would love to hear your reflection on what you think poets can do that might be effective or make a difference in this time. I mean, everybody can do something, but do poets have any particular area or talent that they can bring? What do you do, for example, to feel like you're being not just passive, but engaged?
What I do as a poet may or may not overlap with what I think I should do as a citizen or a person. I'm glad that I read to you a poem in which I say that William Butler Yeats is one of the things that makes me want to get up in the morning. And later in the poem, the first poem of the book, later I say, in some ways, Yeats was a jerk.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote marching songs for the Irish fascists. He was very interested in, what was his name, Mosby, the would-be British Hitler. He, in some level, was a kind of poorly educated, sentimental jerk. But he wrote great poems, some of the people quote in times of great political stress and turmoil. Sometimes he wrote it for very different times, but he did something. So what I think I should do as a voter or a father or a son or a cousin, I won't deny that it overlaps with what I want to do as a poet. But I go back to Rivette talking about the importance of the meanings and the importance of the sounds. When I made, well, we gave a big, it was a successful concert with those musicians. I hope, the poems, they're there. The poem of names is there. The album has these poems that had to do with what I perceive as a limbo that we're living in, a borderland. Borderlands are very scary. We read about particular borders all the time now in the news. the Eastern European border with the war, the Gaza Israel border and the Gaza Egypt border, and then borders like the border in Azerbaijan and border in Congo and the border in Yemen that are less, they're all limbo, and our thinking is borderland thinking as well. So I hope there are meanings there of that kind, but I'm not much of an expert in those meanings. I'm a well-meaning amateur. I do my best, but I know I'm not that great at it. I don't yield to anybody in arranging the sounds. I've devoted my life to trying to be good at that, so that I'm willing to say I don't think anybody's better at it than I am. Just the vowels and consonants and the sentence sounds. So my response to your question is somewhere in there. You take the number of words I just said and divide that number and take the average. That's what I think.
Thank you.
Question?
Yes, Don Schofield.
Um,
Ben Judy Bertelsson. Yes.
you talk about music and you talk about sound, and I'm with you all the way on that as a writer. But music is also rhythm. I'm wondering what role rhythm plays in your approach and your actual writing.
Rhythm is overemphasized in the teaching of poetry and talking about it. People talk about cadence and rhythm. Every sentence has a melody. And the melody, my friend, the horn player, the saxophone player on that album, Stan Strickland, has a thing he likes to ask people. Everybody knows that all music has three components: rhythm, harmony, and melody. Which do you think came first? Nearly everybody says rhythm. Talk about the heartbeat. Stan says, I don't think so. I think melody is more fundamental. He said, baby starts expressing feelings immediately. He said, my dog sings. My dog gives melodies. Melody being hungry, being happy, being angry. He can't keep time. Neither can the baby. Rhythm comes later. The first thing, the most expressive thing is the melody. So, of course, they're all important. In poetry, the harmony has got to do with patterns of like sounds. Rhythm's important. But what people need to hear that they often fail to hear is the melody. So if you ask people to read something they like, if they're in their 70s or 80s, they might read lyrics by Cole Porter or Mitchell Parish. If they're in their 60s or 70s, they might read lyrics by Joni Mitchell or Bob Dylan. If they're younger, they might read Tupac Shakur or I don't know what. They have learned to hear the melody in actual song, but to hear the melody in, here's a two-line poem I like as an example. They have not had the cultural means to hear the melody in on love, on grief, on every human thing. Time sprinkles Lethe's water with his wing. I'll do it. It's a virtue of a two-line poem. You can say it twice without enraging people. On love, on grief, on every human thing, time sprinkles Lethe's water with his wing. The rhythm is very familiar. It's iambic pentameter. Well varied. The harmony is striking. That poem is often my favorite example of explaining what I mean by saying that poetry is a bodily art. When I say that poem, 3 times at the beginning, I put my upper teeth on my lower lip, on love, on grief, on every human thing. And 3 times at the end, I purse my lips. Time sprinkles Lethe's water with his wing. That's the harmony. The pentadea, bia, 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 ba, ba, bia, bia, ba, ba, bia is the rhythm. The melody, yeah, I, are you there? La, 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 la. And that is the most expressive part. That's the part that's most like the dog or the baby. So, of course, they all are important. And if you want to pursue the art, you have to find your particular own way of thinking about all 3. Judy Bertelson, and then Michael Dillon Welch. Yes, Judy. We can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
There. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to call our attention to your poem At Mount Auburn Cemetery, which
Yes.
is one of my big favorites. And I have it up here right now from the New Yorker. And in particular, you know, the way it begins, walking among the graves for exercise. Where do you get your ideas? How do I stop them? And you go through some of the gravestones you're seeing of important people. And then within a few lines, you're with your cat, Bobo, dying in your arms. And his green eyes told me, I am not done yet. Oh, we all have been there, and it's just such a it's just such a good poem.
Thank you, Judy.
I
you.
enjoyed it very much, and as a matter of fact, I sent you a poem. I don't know if you ever got it, but I sent you a poem about my cat, which I named Roshi because I mean the poem is called Roshi, but his name was Simon. But he was a Roshi, you know, he was a teacher.
Yeah.
His very calm, matter of fact way of dying was so well, so Buddhist and so Roshi like.
Yeah. Now I remember. Thank you for sending me the poem. And death is one of the things that we have an opportunity to study in animals whose lives are, for most of them, though not all, shorter than our human lives. And they're one of the many things you can learn by having an actual relationship with an animal. One of the things that can help you deal with and think about is death. Thank you, Judy, for saying that about my poem and for quoting that. I think it's one of the times I feel I said something true when I said, where do you get your ideas? How do I stop them? I feel like the problem in writing is not getting an idea. It's somehow coming down to have thinking about your dealing with your thoughts to be a little less like trying to take a sip from a fire hose. How do you manage that restless, crazy, very forceful forceful stream of perceptions and feelings that sometimes, though it's forceful, you feel it doesn't have a right to be called thoughts. It's the stream of being in your mind. And how do you, it's why we meditate. Concentrate on the breath and the one word, and you may have some chance of having an idea rather than the fire hose of ideas. Michael Dillon Welch.
Yeah, hi. I have a two-part question. First part is, does the name Janet Lewis mean something to you?
It rings a bell. I couldn't tell you exactly how.
So I had the privilege of interviewing her a few years ago. She died at age 99.
Now I
Um,
remember. Yes, I can remember my wife and I visiting her after the death of Ivor Winters. We bought her Stock, was the name of the flower, and she had a very. When Winters died, he said to Ken Fields, "Oh, take care of Janet. She won't last long after I'm gone." She lasted
so,
about 15, 20 years after he was gone. He
well,
had
much longer than that.
interest in music. She bought a beautiful sound system. She found there was a young musician who was going to become her roommate, and Janet had an extremely rich, happy life.
So I had the chance to interview Janet in
Yes,
1998, the year before she died at age 99.
yeah.
She was an imagist poet. She was, for those who don't know her, she was most famous for the novel The Wife of Martin Guerre that was made into
But also,
movies.
the wife of Martin Guerre. Uh, there's a couple of historical novels that are very good.
Yeah,
I'm forgetting the
yeah,
title of the other, but go on.
yeah. And she was the wife of Ivor Winters, and
Yes.
that I believe you studied under. And I'd like to hear your comments about your relationship with him. And just so you know, I got to interview her in her house in Palo Alto, and to know that he was there, and maybe you had visited there. I don't know.
I had visited there once or twice. I didn't have the distinction that my friends Ken Fields and Jim McMichael did of being Winter's gardener. Uh, I think that I learned immense amount. He gave me the great gift of 16th and 17th century poetry. The importance of really the first generation of really great poets in English, not just Shakespeare, but not just Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, but people like Walter Raleigh, Fulk Greville, George Gascoigne, maybe the first of them. That was one of the many great gifts I got from Ivor Winters, and he used to say he had read all the poems by any poet of any reputation in English. So if you wanted to disagree with him about anything, you better do the same. But he tolerated me. He would finish explaining why Whitman was no good or why Yeats was inferior to T. Sturge Moore. And he would say, Mr. Pinsky may want to express the opposite opinion. And then I would talk ineffectively for 4 or 5 minutes. He thought I was, the fact that I was a Jew from the East Coast was amusing to him. He thought it was funny and he indulged me. He was very kind to me.
Thank you. In the chat, I pasted a link to my interview with Kate Cordage with Janet
Thank
Lewis.
you. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. I have not been following the chat, but I'm very glad to hear it. I probably should click some of these things because the chat sometimes disappears after after the session is over. So, Lucan, and Lisa, I think we're getting towards the end of our time, right? You're muted.
Must we be? Can't we keep going? I don't know. Lucian, what do you say? Oh, definitely keep going. And it would be great, Robert, if you're willing to read a few more of your poems,
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'll read the poem. I'll read the poem that Judy was nice enough to refer to. It too is in this book, uh, at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Many of you probably know that cemetery in here in Cambridge, right near the Watertown border. Um, it's a mecca for birders. Birders come from all over the world for the birds in that cemetery, and there's a lot of other protected wildlife, water animals, deer. Nowadays, turkeys, of course, are everywhere. Um, and it's a living museum of trees. You can see an immense American elm. The American elm, once very common, now almost wiped out by fungus that came with ships from Europe. But you can see a glorious American elm, probably 100 feet, 150 feet tall and wide. And it is a really wonderful place to go for a walk, among other things, at every time of year. It's beautiful in a different way. And they have a wonderful staff of arborists and gardeners who maintain it. And there must have been a lot of donors and gifts and good investments where it's beautifully maintained. And anybody can go there and take a walk. It's a spectacular setting. A little known, meaningless fact is the Mount Auburn Cemetery. It was once a farm in the Creeley family. I think it was sold by the great grandparents or grandparents of the poet Robert Creeley. As I say, it's a meaningless fact, but a kind of interesting one. At Mount Auburn Cemetery, walking among the graves for exercise, where do you get your ideas? How do I stop them? Looking for Mike Mazur's marker, I looked down at the grass and saw Stanisław Baranczak, our solidarity poetry reading in Poznan. Years later in Newton, now he said, I'm a US liberal with a car like everybody else. When I held Bobo dying in my arms, his green eyes told me, I am not done yet. Then he was gone. When he was young, he enjoyed leaping up onto the copy machine to press a button and hear it hum to life and rustle a blank page and then another out onto its tray. Sometimes he batted the pages down to the floor. I used to call it his hobby. Here's a marble wicker bassinet marking a baby's grave. To sever the good fellowship of dust, the vet's needle, first a sedative, then death. Now Willie paces the house, moaning his elegy for Bobo. They never meow to one another, just to people or to their nursing mother when they're small. I marvel at this massive labeled American elm spreading above a cluster of newer names. Chang, Owenessian, Kondakis, joining Howells, Emerson, Shaw. And here's a 6-foot sphere of polished granite, perfect and inscribed Walker. Should I have let him die his own cat way? The cemetery official confided, Bruce Lee spends less on a stone than Schwarzenegger. What will mark the markers when, like mourners, they bow and kneel and fall down flat to kiss the heaps they have in trust under the splendid elm, also marked with its tag, a noble survivor? Civilization lifted my cat from the street, gave him a name, his shots, and managed his death. Now Willie howls the loss from room to room. When people say, I'm ashamed of being German, said Arendt, I want to say, I'm ashamed of being human. Sometimes, when Bobo made his copies of nothing, I'd crumple one for him to chase and combat in the game of being himself. I suppose that's one of my definitions of poetry is I play the game of being myself, which speaks back to that question of Suzanne of what do you do? Try to play the game of being yourself as well as you can. Well, I'll read another new poem, and then I'll find something to close with. Here's another one that harks back to those days in Stanford when I was learning from Winter. Winters, by the way, gave me the gift of the 17th century poem that I allude to. I don't know if you know George Herbert's great poem, Church Monuments. I'll try to do it by heart. If I don't, I will find it very quickly. I know where I have it. Herbert writes a poem about before he goes in to pray, he goes to where the church monuments are. Full inscriptions saying, here lies so-and-so knight or baron. And I think if I can do the great first sentence, I may then be able to do the rest of the poem. Church monuments. While I repair to my devotions, while that my soul repairs to her devotions, here I entomb my flesh, that it betimes may take acquaintance of these heaps of dust to which the blast of death's incessant motion, fed by the exhalation of our crimes, drives all at last. I don't think I should wreck it by doing a vaudeville trick of having it by heart. I think I do, but I think it's better to just read the poem to you. It's the poem that I quote in my poem. While that my soul repairs to her devotion, here I entomb my flesh, that it betimes may take acquaintance of this heap of dust to which the blast of death's incessant motion, fed by the exhalation of our crimes, drives all at last. Therefore, I gladly trust my body to this school, that it may learn to spell its elements and find its birth written in dusty heraldry and lines, which dissolution sure doth best discern, comparing dust with dust and earth with earth. These laugh at jet and marble, put for signs to sever the good fellowship of dust and spoil the meeting. What shall point out them when they shall bow and kneel and fall down flat to kiss those heaps which now they have in trust? Dear flesh, while I do pray, learn here thy stem and true descent, that when thou shalt grow fat and wanton in thy cravings, thou mayst know that flesh is but the glass which holds the dust that measures all our time, which also shall be crumbled into dust. Mark here below how tame these ashes are, how free from lust, that thou mayst fit thyself against thy fall. As I say, that was a gift to me from Ivor Winters, George Herbert's Church Monuments. That play was, what shall point at them when they shall bow and kneel and fall up flat to kiss the heaps? It's the gravestone over many decades, kneeling and bowing and falling flat. but it's like they're acting out hysterical mourners who do that. Your flesh, expensive, precious. Well, I do pray, learn here thy stem in true descent. What is your ancestry? It's not your noble ancestors. It's dust and clay. Holly York, we see that you have a relationship with somebody who says, isn't this ball more interesting than whatever you're doing?
A large dog. He's very much a poetry fan.
Yes, good. I think I'll read two more poems to you, but I welcome any other comments or requests or kind critiques.
I have another question. I try to follow your poetry from the time that you were younger until today. And I'm curious, I mean, with the background that you have and the years of teaching, how do you feel? The question is similar to what the student asked in Texas, but it's not exactly the same. How do you feel? I mean, you gain so much knowledge and you are so proficient with poetry and with the world of poetry. And how do you feel toward, eventually coming to an end? How is that at this time in your life? How is that affecting your poetry? How do you feel that if there's any change from the time that you were younger?
In many significant ways, maybe the most significant ways, my problems and difficulties and anxieties are exactly the same as they were when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, or 30, 34, or 47, or 59. My anxieties about whether I can ever write anything good again. My feelings of inadequacy, my confused ambitions, my craving to make something better, my forcing myself to keep working on a prose project I'm working on, where I look at it and I hate it, think it's not any good. My desperate hope that I'll get a wonderful poem going today or tomorrow. Those really are constants. It's kind of comfort to me after all these years to say, here we go again. And it's no different. The same problems that you had when you were very young, you have now when you're very old. I suppose they're sharpened by knowing that death is much closer. The end is near. But to a surprisingly great extent, it's just exactly the same. Maybe with a little added, get going, you asshole. There's not that much time left. Do something. In some profound way, it's just the same set of challenges and difficulties and hopes. It hasn't changed all that much. It's one of my jobs for me to tell my students, whatever struggles like the ones I just tried to describe you have, don't think you're going to write something that's going to fix them all. They're your job. You're just going to try to develop ways to keep dealing with them, but they're not going to relent. In a way, they're not going to relent if you're lucky. If you're fortunate, you're going to keep having those impatiences and self-loathings and daydreams and hopes. They're your mission. They're what you have to deal with. This is the poem I was going to read that goes back to being 21 years old and a student of Ivor Winters at Stanford. The poem is called Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce. I saw him in San Francisco at the Purple Onion when I was still at Stanford, a teaching assistant getting the Ode to a Nightingale by heart. Out of prison on bail, soon he would die. One of the charges against him was saying schmuck. He reminded me of my teacher, Irving Howe. That impatience of an improvising spirit hurtling beyond a footnote or a punchline like a light-winged dryad in the trees. The comic with months to live was only 40. I thought he talked too much about his trials. Forgive me, please. I was barely 24. The cover charge on my tiny fellowship, a tender gesture, menaced by hornets and grackles. Is money all you people think about? Being a lizard, I'm not sure what to say. John Keats, in a letter, says that now he's ready, quote, to cheat as well as any literary Jew, end quote. One more example, ho-hum. How could it matter to me as a secret reptile from outer space, charmed by your human poetry and music? How happened to be at Stanford that one year? My poetry teacher, Ivor Winters, deplored the, quote, awful mess, end quote, of Keats's mind. I did get him to concede the ode was beautiful. He seemed surprised and happy when I told him Howe had assigned his essay on Henry James. All right, it's true. We killed him. What a bad scene. It was us. My family did it. We found a note. I killed Jesus in the basement, signed Cousin Morty. End quote. I'm grateful to Lenny Bruce for saying that. I pardon Keats for being a schmuck. The word, a homey metaphor, meaning a bangle, a gem. Diminutive for a child is schmeckel, a spoken precious ornament, weighed and appreciated in the jazzy, sacred scales of appropriation.
Mhm.
And I do remember that joke of Lenny Bruce's and thinking, what a relief. All right, we killed him. Cousin Morty did it. That's my Stanford reminiscence. Anything else anybody wants to do, or I'll just read a short poem and then we'll part. Anything else cooking?
Thank you. Thank you,
Truly,
Robert.
truly a pleasure. Thank you all for your attention and the good questions.
Robert, well, first of all, thank you for showing to us today great examples of what Brodsky described as accelerated thinking. because that's something that I find in a lot of your work, this incredible velocity of being that you embody with your words.
Mhm.
And I do want to quote back to you and to the others joining us, something I just read in Jersey Breaks, your new memoir. You wrote, reciting sailing to Byzantium to myself, I decided to do as the poem says. Once out of nature, I would never take my bodily form from any natural thing. What do those words mean? Without being able to say precisely, I relate bodily form to Ralph Ellison's distinction between relatives and ancestors. You choose your ancestors, he says in his essay on Richard Wright. Wright was a relative, says Ellison, and Ernest Hemingway was an ancestor. The Irish writers Joyce and Yeats were not my relatives in nature, but in the workings of form, that mysterious refuge from despair, could I choose them as my ancestors? So that's your own question. Have you been able to choose them as your ancestors? And what can you tell us about the power of choosing our ancestors and how we can actually enact that?
Um, I won't read the entire poem, but I'll read the ending. Give me a second. Lucian, you've made me think. And while I'm thinking and seeking, let me say I also appreciate my great colleague in poetry, Garrett Hungo, for being here. A great favor to me, your presence, Garrett, and a spur to try to do something good. Garrett is here, and thank you.
Robert, it's wonderful to see and hear you, and I've been lucky all my life since I began to hear your words.
Um, I'll make this the last poem I read. So instead of reading two, I'll read this poem to you. It's called Forgiveness. And I'm hoping that in the course of it, it will respond to Lucian's question. The poem is called Forgiveness. And it's relevant to the ways that Garrett and I are both, we hope we remain students, and speaks to our history as students of poetry. Forgiveness. The mind skitters, its one rudder being its own voice. The great fascist poet taught me free verse, trying to concentrate on the forgiving of an unforgivable crime in a lecture by Emmanuel Levinas. I drift into Keely Smith, being Cherokee. The desire for ver lieb, says Pound in his hectoring way, is, quote, quantity reasserting itself after years of starvation, end quote. Reading that, I got the idea. Just like in music, longer is different from higher, like with long E's. And it was called quantity. I could hear it. The third syllable longer, the first one stressed by pitch. Bitterness, Cherokee, Popinjay. I don't pretend I was thinking about the Trail of Tears. or any other unforgivable crime. I was thinking about how well she imitates Louis Prima's pelvis forward walk, mocking the magic of it while singing like an angel in a prom dress, and how great it would be to write something that funny and impassioned. The cadences and quantities of Pound's Exile's Letter break my heart as a ritual of truth, the remote spoken ceremony of atonement. At the same time, I scorn that nostalgic celebration of drunken friendship among exquisite diplomats of an ancient ruling class, and starvation as a figure of speech. The airy dynamo of song animates the shadows. And speaking of shadows, who has a right to forgive? White soldiers took away the Arapahoes' horses. In old Ukraine, the nationalists first mutilated some Jews, then made them dance and sing naked before killing them, as a way of showing what they'd like to do to the Poles. Or was it to the invading Germans? Is the point humiliation beyond forgiveness? Do the damned impregnate the enslaved to make an unforgivable point? Also to deny it? Even poor John Keats, in his letters, enjoys that little minor Jew baiting. Who do I think I am to forgive him? After all, I am him. He too was the child of a New Jersey optician. And please do me a favor. Don't tell me, no, he wasn't. Truly a pleasure talking to you all. See you later.